All right. Hello. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame virtual event. We're so excited to be with you today. My name is Jason Hanley.
I'm Andy Leach.
And we are here for a fantastic event with none other than Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inductee Bill Bruford. Inducted, of course, with the band Yes. And we're going to be having a great conversation with Bill today. You know, Bill Bruford is one of the all-time great drummers, often voted on the top list of all-time drummers, not only for his work with Yes, but for a number of other groups, including King Crimson, UK, played with Genesis, his own bands Bruford and Earthworks, and a number of other artists he's worked with over the years. In fact, just out recently is this fantastic new career retrospective, Bill Bruford, Making a Song and Dance. It's a complete career retrospective, 6 CDs with a book inside. And we're going to be talking about a lot of the music from this and thinking about Bill's career. He's done a lot of different things using technology, thinking about how he works differently with different groups, whether it's a group he's in or a special guest he's taking part in. And we're going to have a sort of talk about that career and how he functioned in different groups at different times. By the way, this isn't the first time we've talked with Bill. He was actually here at the museum a number of years ago, and I got to sit down with him in a Hall of Fame series, mainly focusing on the music of Yes and King Crimson at that time. But Andy, when Bill was here then, we talked to him about donating some of his collection of papers and photos, documents to our library and archive. So we've got this great collection of Bill's.
Yeah, that's right. So we were fortunate to be able to bring Bill over to our library and archives, which is a couple miles from our museum here in Cleveland. And we're going to talk about some of the rich and extensive collection that he donated about a year and a half ago, which covers, again, his whole career from the beginning through, all the way through the early 2000s, documenting his whole lifelong career as a drummer, composer, band leader. And we'll get into some examples and even show some of that today.
That'll be cool. Great to see some of that here in the program today, but also for anybody who's interested can come and make an appointment at the library and archive and actually dig into Bill's collection, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can put a link below to our library and archives and to the finding aid for this collection so people can dig in more and make an appointment and come see it.
We'll also be, of course, referencing Bill's great autobiography, Bill Bruford, The Autobiography, a great book, of course, covering a lot of his work and talking about creativity. We should also mention Bill is also a PhD, and not one that he received as an honorary doctorate, but actually an earned PhD for his work in music as well. So with no other ado, let's welcome the one and only Bill Bruford.
Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are on the planet.
That's right, exactly.
Good to see you, Bill.
Great to see you guys, Jason. And Andy, it's great to see you. And I'm calling you from, I'm in England.
Yeah, thank you so much for connecting in with us. It's one of the sort of silver linings of the pandemic is the technology has really gotten improved so that we can have a really good conversation with you over in England and us here in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Bill. As we said, you've been a great friend to the museum. Both Andy and I are longtime fans of your music. The incredible way throughout your career, I think you've mixed different sounds and styles, whether it's progressive rock, straight up rock and roll, sort of more symphonic sounding stuff, jazz. You've really thought about a lot. And the one thing I appreciate too and want to talk with you about today is I think as an artist, you're somebody who's really thought about the creative process a lot. Even within the box set that just came out, we'll kind of use some of the categories you have on the discs there to guide our conversation today. But this idea of working as a collaborator with other musicians, being a leader in a group, sort of as a composer, being a special guest on somebody else's music, and an improviser. What does it mean to improvise in music? And maybe before we launch into some of those areas and some tunes in that, I just want to open up by asking you, what is it about your life and career that made you think about this idea of creativity so much? You really seem to be a musician who's very aware of what he's doing with groups.
Good question. But I think I only came to the idea of creativity really late on. I mean, musicians don't sit around talking about creativity saying, gee, we were creative tonight.
Right.
They don't really do that. I'm sure the great artists of the past didn't do that one way or another. But later on in life, I started to question what it was I was doing and why was I doing it. and got more and more interested in that aspect, the psychological aspect of performance, if you like. Why musicians do the things they do. Is there anything creative about it? If there is something creative about it, how does that affect their performance, or how does it influence their performance? And is there any of that would help musicians if we investigated that and try to find out what musicians want and what they do? And part of the box set really is arranged in these four contexts, really, of performing with musicians. So you're performing with others, collaboratively. For example, Yes and King Crimson. You might be performing as a leader. It's your own thing. You do what you want, as in my own band, Bruford or Earthworks. You could be performing for a leader, of course, where you're getting a whole bunch of directions. And what you're playing isn't necessarily what you would have first thought, but it's what the leader wants. And finally, you could be performing without a leader at all, and you'd be improvising quite possibly. So there's four contexts there, which I think is a good way to hang 70 tracks around if you're talking box set.
Yeah, right. And, a lot of different tracks too. I think one great thing about the box set and your career in general, Bill, is you've played with so many different groups. And I think there's an element that I can always tell it's a Bill Bruford participation event. I can hear your sound in it, but also it's so varied. Like you're able to jump into a lot of these different contexts and sort of always seem to serve the moment, right?
I think so. I think that's what a musician's supposed to do. First of all, you've got to make the music work functionally. You've got to provide the right thing. And then you can get fancy a little later on if you want to change the history of drumming. You might want to not do the same thing in both those things in the same tune. Some tunes are better if you want to change the history of drumming. Other tunes are better if you just keep quiet and do exactly what the music requires.
I think you mentioned either maybe it's in the liner notes of the box set. Just at some points you stay out of the way of the music, right? I think you have to in some cases.
Getting out of the way of the music is definitely part of it. The music doesn't exist for you. You exist for the music. So it's not a place for you to show off in. It's a place where you're trying to make the music work. And we were talking recently. I was talking with a friend about there's a couple of tracks on the album that I don't even play on. So I think you could call that staying out of the way of the music.
Lay back, right? Way back.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we can start with one of those categories. Let's start with that collaborator sort of category that the first two discs hit at, because those also probably hit at some of the more, moments that you're working with a lot of other musicians. And let's start with the band Yes. Of course, fantastic group. You're inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a member of Yes. Along, we should mention, with another great drummer, Alan White, who just passed recently.
Indeed. So sorry to hear that. Yes.
You talk about one of the songs that you played on is Heart of the Sunrise by Yes from 1971, off of Fragile, of course. I think one of my favorite songs, that bass intro kind of solo from Chris Squire, is just fantastic. But that song has so much going on in it. And you mentioned even in the liner notes of the box set that for you, that was sort of a moment where Yes started to come together, this idea of collaboration, that you guys were really clicking at that time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The members of the band, when it started, were from very different backgrounds. And so, first of all, you're going to try to find out what music means to you. This wasn't a rock band all from the same street in the Midlands of England, or a bunch of guys from I don't know, Asbury Park, New Jersey or something, who were all mates. We were all from different places altogether. And so we all had different ideas of what even music meant to us all. And so for a while we were a covers band, and which I think is an honorable thing to be. I like being in a covers band. I think playing standard songs allows you to decorate or adorn the music with your own style and characteristic. So we were a covers band for a while, and then we got better at that, and we thought, wow, this section's great. Let's double the length of this section and play it backwards, and then, we'll have fun with that, et cetera, et cetera. And our variations on the standard song that everybody knew became more and more elaborate.
Right.
From there, it was only a small step to saying, well, why don't we write a new introduction for this, or change its tempo or something. And before you know it, you've dispensed with the original song altogether, and you're writing your own original material. Even that didn't go immediately to the right place, but we were on Fragile, which, as you say, Jason, I think was a third album, maybe a fourth album.
Yeah, fourth, yep.
Before I hit, what is only my opinion, I mean, everybody else has their opinion, before we hit kind of pay dirt with Heart of the Sunrise, the song that you mentioned, where I think we all sort of agreed that this was a good version. This was a template, really, for how we should go about doing things. It had all the hallmarks of a longer, progressive song. And so we liked that, and that was really good. And out of that, on a similar basis, really, from that template came Close to the Edge, which was the last record I made with the band, and then I changed to another band after that. But Heart of the Sunrise remains a very strong piece of music for me personally and emotionally. And I even wrote a bit of it too, so I was encouraged to do that.
Right. And of course, on Fragile, each of you guys were trying different things in writing. And I think you're right, Close to the Edge really is many people talk about that as being, probably one of the best Yes albums of all time, because it's a elaborate, record with only a handful of pieces on it, and all intricately worked out by you guys.
Indeed so. They were great days, and I loved the band very much. And I didn't leave the band because I didn't like it. I loved the band because I almost loved it too much and had to go and do something else.
Right.
Yeah. In fact, maybe if we can pull up one of the images from Bill's collection, we have this is from one of his scrapbooks. And
my word!
Which really several scrapbooks that cover his entire 40-year career meticulously and in a very well organized way. But here's an example of some clippings from there, and here we even see Alan White joining Yes and Bill leaving Yes to join Crimson.
No, leaving Yes to get a haircut.
Yeah, and I know. I mean, from what I remember reading in your autobiography, you took a lot of maybe some criticism, or maybe just there were a lot of questions about why would you leave such a successful band kind of at its peak, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of that talk, understandably, but what can I say? I was a young kid. I was only 22 or something. I'd only been a professional musician for 4 years, and I barely played anything at all before Yes. So all I'd seen for 4 years in front of me was the same 4 rear ends.
Right.
And they were delightful rear ends. I mean, I couldn't want for nicer, but I'd only seen those 4 guys. I'd only heard myself in one musical context in my whole life.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to stay in that my whole life at all. So I wanted to get out, see some other guys, see some other faces, hear some other sounds, and watch how I worked with other people. I might have been terrible. It turned out okay, but yeah. So perfectly straightforward to me.
Sure.
I think too, if we talk about Crimson for a minute, again, particularly thinking of that idea of collaborating with other musicians, as you just mentioned, Crimson is a very different organization than Yes, right? I mean, Robert Fripp is a very particular personality in the band, and you, of course, famously have played in a number of really great lineups in King Crimson. Think of the early stuff like Red with John Wetton in that, or the lineup kind of later in the 80s that featured Adrian Belew and the great Tony Levin playing along with you guys. One of the tunes that's on the box set, and one of my favorites from the album Three of a Perfect Pair, is the title song, Three of a Perfect Pair. There's even a live version of that from the Absent Lovers CD. What's that moment of playing live with King Crimson like, and how is that different maybe from what your experience with Yes was?
Well, all good questions. When we were compiling Heart of the Sunrise or Close to the Edge, we didn't know what we were compiling. We probably couldn't have played it all the way through. We didn't know. We took a break, and then we come back and say, what should we play for the next 16 bars? Right. It was being written in the studio under a clock ticking. At the end of that, you could play the song, but you didn't know what it was until you'd finished the album. With King Crimson, on the whole, we talked less. It was a quicker process. We knew what we were going to record and could probably play the song. We definitely could play the song all the way through as an ensemble, even though it might be 7 minutes long. We pretty much rehearsed it somewhere. So it was a faster process for sure. And after a few nights on the road or a few weeks on the road, you've got it completely under your sticks, as it were. And Three of a Perfect Pair, I think, was probably a year old by the time of this recording. We probably wrote it in 83, recorded in 84. Yeah. But this recording didn't appear until many years later.
1998, I think it came out. Yeah.
98, okay, 1998. So there you have a funny disconnect, really, between some work that you did 15 years earlier that suddenly crops up and you think, yeah, that sounds good. And to me, sometimes the live version is better than the studio version. I don't know why.
Do you think that is? What's that element for you?
Let's call it an audience.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be that. Of course, there's an audience in the studio too, which is your other colleagues and the recording engineer and the tea lady.
Right.
They're all there as well. But there's something about live in the moment, which is great. And I think this is the best version of Three of a Perfect Pair there is. But again, these are my opinions only. You could ask anybody else in King Crimson and they'd have a different answer.
Right. I think that I like that phrase you said, like after a couple nights, you've got it under your sticks, right? Like, you know, the mechanics of what the tune is then.
Yeah.
Does that open up space for you to then find that little way you can maybe play it a little different and add more feeling to it or something?
Yeah, totally. You come to trust your legs and arms are going to go in the right place.
Right.
So that bit's taken care of. So you can listen more. Psychologically, I'd often put my head and my ears out in the back of the room, look down on the band and say, is this thing swinging or not? Are we out here? Where are we out? How can I make this better? But all that can be considered and is running in the back of your head, even while your legs and arms are doing the right thing, because you've trained them up to do that. It's fun. I recommend trying live playing. It's scary.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons I would recommend this box set is so that people can hear a lot of songs they've heard on these original recorded versions that we've all gotten used to, but to hear them, you know, in these kind of new contexts. And I think you even mentioned in the liner notes, I think, that sometimes it's better the longer it's been since the original, the longer that time elapses, the better, because you have more learning.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's this box set is not a greatest hits. You know, this is not the most popular versions of these things necessarily. They're the ones that I'm intrigued by and I feel proud of, and I want to put them on a box set. So it's a highly personal view of what it is that I've done. And somebody else, you know, if you gave it to a record company guy, they'd probably pick, you know, the most famous versions of everything. These are not necessarily the most famous versions.
Yeah, I think that's what makes it actually more interesting is finding some real gems in here, or some things that you've picked that maybe I thought, wow, that's an interesting choice. You know. Good.
Yes, indeed.
There's a line in your book where you say something like, life and music are both dirty and imperfect. And I wonder if you think maybe the live performance is more like life than studio recording.
There's an aspect of perfection required in studios. And often it's sonic perfection. So, you know, the drummer is hauled in and said, well, you know, you're 3 milliseconds late on the bass drum. You know, and that may be true, but music is from its very roots, it is an imperfection, sonic imperfection, artistic imperfection. It's a clash of things going on all the time, which can be a very sweet clash if you know how to do it and how to create that. But it's not something you're going to measure on an oscilloscope. And compute it to death. It doesn't really work that way. So, you know, I think towards the late 80s, as the computer took hold in the recording studio, some of us fell under its seduction. Yeah. And felt that if it looked perfect on a screen, it was going to sound perfect. That's not always the case.
Yeah, you're right. And a good example, you know, musicians don't play sheet music exactly as written. Everybody puts their own touches, their own swing, their own kind of phrasing on things.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Before we move on, thinking about Yes and King Crimson for a minute too, I think one of the things, Bill, that you talk about in your autobiography quite a bit, and actually is in some of the papers from the collection here, is the business of music that happens around that, particularly when you've got a group and a lot of people, and there's royalties and there's touring schedules and all of these other things. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect? Because I think, you've been pretty open in your autobiography and other places about there are many pitfalls of the music business, but also it's there and helps you make a living as a musician and connect with audiences. Like, what's that maybe sort of relationship with the business side of music?
It's a big subject, but it's not one that I was ever afraid of. I was always interested in it because I'm so old that we came from an amateur business where, the accountants didn't know how to account. The managers were making it up as they went along and taking too much money for it. The musicians didn't care about anything. And broadly, there was always going to be more money tomorrow than there was today. So you didn't really care very much. So somebody would say, we just made a loss of, God knows how many thousands of dollars in the States, but don't worry, that'll come out of the record royalties. And the listener, I don't think, realizes that he gets the music he pays for in a way,
Right.
that we can only do so much if there's some money there. If there isn't any money, it's very hard to operate.
Right.
And musicians need to eat. And it's in the pre-digital days, it was very important to try to get the money right and have a good manager and a good accountant. And basically, we got better at it as we went on. But most of the British bands I was associated with ran at a loss for many years.
Mm-hmm.
They ran, so every time they went out to play, you might get a fee of $500 or something, but it cost you $800 to do the gig.
Wow, right.
So, we would be digging a hole forever into deeper and deeper debt. There weren't really any investors. What you needed was a hit record. So right before that first song you mentioned, Heart of the Sunrise, I can remember a meeting, probably 6 months before that, where we were down to our last $50,
Wow.
I mean, the whole idea, the whole edifice that became a very famous band was hanging by a thread of, $50, and we would have been history. So,
and we have in your very organized, meticulously collected collection, we have examples, and we don't have to dig into the details of this, but here's one example here, just showing sort of the financial state of things at the end of 1971 in great detail. And we don't have to, like I said, we don't have to read every line here, but suffice it to say, there are multiple documents kind of outlining this from that era, and it's fascinating.
Yeah, and the most important thing is there ain't no money in the bank. We're running at a loss there.
Yeah,
Yes,
which you can see from this document.
exactly,
Right?
exactly.
Yeah, and aren't the sums pitifully small? These are British pounds, so I can't do a conversion for you, but these are relatively small sums of money,
Yeah.
But if you don't have any money, you don't have any money for the van, you ain't going to the gig. So that was
Right.
trying to stay in business, and it was a real skill.
Yeah, there's another great document that I'm going to queue up here that it's a bit later, but it's so this is what's interesting is, of course, you left in 1972, but you're obviously still tied financially to that group forever, right? So here in 97, you're still having to chase down royalties,
Yeah, sure.
were due to you, right?
Sure. The music business is a bit like Hotel California. You can tell people you've checked out, but you can never leave. It's, it's always on your desk. I could sit down today and find $500 that somebody owes me somewhere if I could be bothered. It's because it's such a complicated accountancy trick.
Yeah.
Collecting tiny sums of money from all over the world, from an Argentinian jukebox, through a Peruvian promoter, back to a European collection agency, to my house. That's a long way.
Yeah.
And of course, every time someone takes a slice out of that, so your $10 it started with ends up at 50 cents for me. But that's okay.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm just finishing to say it's a very, very intricate business.
Right. And I mean, in your collection, because we have it here, we can see how much you're having to sort of chase down these payments. But I wonder, were you better at doing that than the average rock musician of the day, or do you think was everyone having to do this?
Well, everybody had, everybody had to do it. Not everybody did.
Okay.
I mean, depending on your psychology, you could either accept what you're given and hope for the best, or you could say, but this isn't anywhere close to the right kind of number it should be, which is what it came down to. And some had more or less interest. Sometimes the managers were better or worse. They were generally well-meaning, but sometimes hopeless. Generally speaking, the promoters we played for were always very good. And you'll know now that in the United States, actually, the top guys that we played for in the 1970s are still the top guys today.
Right.
And the reason for that is they're damn good at it, and they never screwed anybody over, which is really good. So we kept our eyes on these things very much.
Yeah. Well, I think let's move on to the next category that you use in the box set to organize the career, and that's the composing leader. So this is a kind of role where you're actually acting as the composer, leading a group. And here we've got examples of your bands that you had. We'll start with the band Bruford, which you did a number of albums with. And I picked a tune here to ask you about, Bill, that you mentioned there's some things on the box set that technically you don't even play on, and this is one of them, which is Palewell Park, which is off of Gradually Going Tornado from 1981.
Yeah.
You've got pianist Dave Stewart and bass player Jeff Berlin playing a gorgeous tune. You're not playing drums, but this is you as a composer and band leader, right?
It is indeed. Yeah. I think at an early age, we all realized that the guy who wrote the song was an important guy. Didn't quite figure out why, but it's the reason Mick Jagger got in the Rolls Royce and Charlie Watts got in the van at the back.
Right. Very true. The royalties associated with the songwriting, right?
The royalties associated with a songwriter, absolutely. So pretty soon you realize that that's going to be half of your income, or it can be. So that gets really important. And I got a little bit better at it. And this song, Palewell Park, very nostalgic for me. Palewell Park was the park around the corner from my house in London, and where Dave Stewart and I played football, among other things. And we're kids. It was a kind of nanny baby factory, where we all had our early kids, babies and so forth. And Palewell Park, I spent many sunny evenings in. It was a lovely, lovely green spot in London. London has many green spots. And I wrote this thing at the piano, and, I couldn't think of anything that the drums could do. So maybe have them silent. Dave took it on board as a pianist and loved it. And of course, it became a bass feature for our wonderful US bass player, Jeff Berlin, who performs the most staggering bass solo on it. It's the most beautiful bass solo. And in England at the time, nobody could do that at all. It was completely impossible. So it really freezes a moment of great happiness for me, and a great moment for Jeff Berlin, particularly on bass.
Yeah. It shows, too, your ability, your kind of songwriting in Bruford there, going more into the jazz side of things than the rock side on a tune like that.
Yeah, very true. I grew up with jazz. I always thought I was going to be a jazz drummer. Mm-hmm. In fact, when we formed Yes, I thought it was going to be a jazz group. Little did I know.
Right. Although I would say you certainly can hear your jazz stylings throughout Yes, right? I mean, it's even one of the things I often talk about is the difference between you and Alan White. Alan tends to be more of a rock drummer, and you're both great drummers, but just different styles.
Yeah, I think you're quite right. Yeah, I had a lighter touch. I'm looking to do it a different way often. Mm-hmm. These are typical jazz tropes, as they say. And Alan was more a rock guy, absolutely. There was a lovely description, I think, when we were both in the same band at the same time, both in Yes at the same time, two drummers.
With the Union tour in that.
It was a Union tour, and I think either a critic or a wit or somebody backstage said that Alan White was I was the hollandaise sauce to Alan White's meat and potatoes. Which I thought was pretty good.
Right. Another one I wanted to ask you about, and maybe even have you talk a little bit about Earthworks. I've always been a big fan, I think, Andy, too, of Earthworks, because you did so many interesting things under that banner, the idea of Earthworks. Mm-hmm. Nerve is the one I was going to talk about, only because, again, there's a great live version on the box set. performed in New York City in 1992 at the Bottom Line, great club.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about the recorded version of Nerve is great, but that live version, you mentioned earlier this idea of really kind of getting at it. You really feel it on a recording like that.
Yeah, I think so. Same principle involved. You know, somehow the original perhaps was being invented that time. Perhaps the clock was running late. It was okay in the studio, but in a relaxed scene at the Bottom Line, you know, a few months later, you'll get a better version, almost certainly. And I really liked it. The drum line, you'll know this, Jason, has a kind of slipping feeling to it. Yeah. Every 2 bars, it's like it takes 3 steps forward, 1 back, 3 steps forward again, 1 back, 3 steps forward, 1 back. It's the rhythm pattern of it gives you that feeling.
Yeah.
But also with young British jazz guys, these are definitely jazz musicians. When I hooked up with these guys in Earthworks, they were all 21 years old and had never heard of Yes or King Crimson, which shows you how, you know, the different worlds that jazz and rock were at the time. Right. Now it's much more blurred, but at the time, that's what's true.
Bill, that's interesting. Was that exciting for you to maybe surround yourself with people who didn't think of you as Bill Bruford of Yes and King Crimson?
Oh, totally.
On purpose?
It's on purpose. It was kind of added bonus that they'd never heard me play the drums, really.
Yeah.
Which was nice. They just took it as read that I seemed like a nice guy. I turned up when I said I'd turn up. I paid what I said I'd pay. And I had clean sheets. What more do you want?
Right. That's great.
So they got on with it. And I said, you know, we've got these things called electronic drums. And I think what we're going to do here is that you guys can play single notes, you know, single note bass, single note saxophone, and single note E-flat tenor horn sometimes. And I will play the chordal information. So that should make us sound a bit different. That didn't work out entirely correctly, but it wasn't a rule, you know, of being in the band. But that's how we started, for sure.
Yeah, we of course we have from your collection some really interesting an interesting folder.
Oh,
some of your home programming, MIDI programming schematics and other kind of instructions. Can you kind of just for the layperson kind of talk about what we're seeing here?
Yes, there's a big machine called the SDX, which is a kind of computer. It's kicking out a code called MIDI information to various boxes, which is telling other boxes what to do. And it's capable of turning some of those boxes on and off. So you might have reverb on a snare drum, but then in a different patch stored in the big box, you can turn that on and off via an MTM, which is the central box. And then you're going to mix it with an automated mixer. But this is all none of these machines really were designed to be run together. Mm-hmm. So all this stuff you can probably do on the back of your watch.
Right.
But in my day, you had to, if you wanted a pitch, see in the top right, it says DX22. That's a Yamaha keyboard.
Yeah, right.
So the bottom left, the big box SDX, is sending information to a Yamaha keyboard saying, play this note. And there are various foot pedals and so forth to put it on, take it off. So, you know, it's quite hard to assemble all this at the time, and you need to spend a bit of some time thinking about it. And you might need a guy who's better at electronics than you are, and I was no good at that at all. All I wanted to do was play some tunes on the drums.
But that's an interesting point too, Bill. I mean, there's 2 pieces about it. So looking at the diagram, you need a diagram like this for your stage plot to make sure each night this gets set up right. But it does allow you to kind of, as you say, play some tunes on the drums, because you're very famous for a lot of the stuff, particularly in Earthworks, I think, of pushing what the drummer, in quotes, I guess, is even doing in the band, right?
Indeed. Indeed. And these days, everybody's fancy, very, very fancy and very slick, and they all have hybrid electronic and acoustic sets. You know, so I'm sure if you're 15, you know all this stuff anyway. And your electronic set from one of the big manufacturers will do a lot of this for you. And you probably have a laptop running at the same time. But all this is recent information, of course. And in my day, it was a dirty job that somebody had to do, and Bruford took it on.
I mean, I know that this early Simmons drums were kind of known for being unreliable and maybe difficult to work with, but I would think they sparked creativity in a way that you wouldn't have experienced otherwise, right?
Oh, well, that's very true, and it's, for me, ever the case that you give a musician a piece of new musical, a new music instrument of some sort, a new piece of musical kit, and you say to the musician, "It does this." And the first thing the musician always says back to the manufacturer is, "But what if it did this?"
Right.
What the manufacturer hasn't allowed for. So, musicians are always doing that. Why? Because they want to be creative. They are creative. They say, "Well, it would be great if I could my Simmons SDX, I could marry that to a Yamaha DX22, etc., etc." And then everybody scratches their heads and say, "Oh no, you can't do that. That'll never work." But eventually it does, and that goes on in all levels of scientific work, of course, and in music just as much in music.
Well, Bill, the next category on the box set is the idea of the special guest, which is essentially, as you describe it, of when you get invited for whatever reason, hopefully for your musicianship, to sit in with somebody else. And there's a couple here I want to mention because I think, well, I guess my guess is your role was maybe different in each of these. One is Chris Squire's awesome solo record, Fish Out of Water, from 1975, which I think chronologically is after you've left Yes at that point.
Correct.
And the great tune Silently Falling. I think there's a very cool push and pull between the drums and the bass throughout that, all the way into the kind of final build-up jam in there.
Yeah, I'm often asked what was the relationship between the bass and the drums, and is it more intimate than anybody else in the band? And I've never really found it like that. I'm not playing so much with the bass players. I'm playing with Chris Squire.
Yeah, right.
It's a slightly subtle difference. I'm playing with the human being rather than the instrument that he plays, and there's something in that particular track that I like a lot. You describe it as a push-pull. Maybe I'm a bit behind him in the track, but it's something that gives it this heavy, unwinding feeling that I really like a lot. And of course, a couple of years before that, I've been performing with him on an entirely collaborative, equal level. 2 years later, I'm working in his studio for him.
Yeah.
Again, a subtle difference. So now what I'm trying to provide is something that Chris actually thinks is right for the track. It's his album. And these are relatively subtle things that maybe our listeners are not interested in, but it changes what you do completely.
Yeah.
With him, let's say, as an example, was it sort of dictated by him to some extent, or was it pretty intuitive to you what he needed?
I would try things, try what I thought was right, like you usually do, like most drummers do. You start with what you think. There's nothing written on paper. You start with what you think is right and appropriate, and you do that until you're stopped. And somebody says, "No, I don't want it there. I want it on a different cymbal, or I want it faster or slower or upside down," something like that. So he was fun to work with. It was great. He was always late to the studio, but aside from that,
famously so, I think, right?
Yeah.
Another one that you have on here, I think, that connects, if Chris Squire connects back to your time with Yes, you end up working with Al Di Meola, the great jazz fusion guitar player, one of my favorites. The song Calliope off his album Scenario from 1983. It's basically the King Crimson rhythm section now. It's you and Tony Levin playing with Al Di Meola. How did that come about, and what was that like for the two of you to kind of sit in and play with Al?
Oh, well, I'll go anywhere where Tony is playing. It's very easy. He never tells me what to play ever, barely ever makes a suggestion. I've tried writing parts out for Tony. That's not a great idea either. It's really a whole lot better if you just let Tony do it, and for obvious good reasons. So we were called, obviously Al's people somehow got in touch with our people, I don't know, and next thing I know, we were in Denver, Colorado, at Bearsville. What was it? Not Bearsville. I forgot what the name of the studio is there. And Al Di Meola is another guy who's wonderful, but also late. He's another guy who's late to the studio. But that's all right, Al. I don't mind. And we did a nice piece. It was great. Yeah, thoroughly enjoyed it.
That's a great story I believe in your autobiography. You sort of talk about how Al's late. Maybe it was a few hours or something, and then Tony was about to leave, and there was a part that Tony just nailed in one take or something like that. It's a great story.
Yeah, it was. It's a real art. You know, he threw down a fairly improvised thing, you would have thought, with all kinds of pushes and little fills and so forth. And then just as he was leaving, he was required to double that. Exactly. So I said, okay, we'll work your way out of that, Tony, because you can't possibly remember what you did there. We're going to have to do several drop-ins. This is going to take an hour or two. I'll see you in an hour or two, okay? Damn me if he doesn't double it exactly, you know, with all, and that is, you know, I've been privileged to be around some serious musicianship in my day. And that's musicianship, you know, a guy who can remember exactly where that finger went at that time.
Crazy. And
so that was a great moment.
Yeah. You've worked with a lot of great guitar players. Another one where you're a special guest is with Kazumi Watanabe, and a song you wrote for his album Spice of Life 2, which I think you also played on Spice of Life 1, the original.
I did.
But you wrote a tune for him called Small Wonder, and what a great Japanese guitar player Kazumi is. What was that like?
He was the Japanese guitar star in the 80s and 90s. He was their Eric Clapton, their Aldi Meola, their Steve Howe, Alan Holdsworth, all rolled into one. He could do fantastic impressions of all those great guitarists.
Wow.
And while he was doing you an impression of Alan Holdsworth, he would look like Alan Holdsworth at the same time. He would adopt the same bodily style.
Yeah.
Somehow he became Alan Holdsworth, which is extraordinary, isn't it? So he was a wonderful player, and he worked with Western musicians a lot. You know, he wanted to make his name in the States and play with a lot of top-line American guys. And also, he's sort of got the Bruford rhythm section, if you like, of Jeff Berlin and myself.
Right.
And Peter John Vitesi, who was on keyboards. And we had a good session. Yeah, at Swan Yard that was at, I remember somehow, in the UK. Yeah.
You know, another example in this category of being a special guest, I admittedly had heard Roy Harper's name for many years and had just never delved into his catalog. And this actually introduced me to the HQ album, which I think is incredible. And Hallucinating Light in particular is just beautiful playing by you, Bill.
Well, it's a lovely song. All I had to do was stay out of the way.
Right. How did you get connected with Roy?
That's a very good question. I've been in Crimson for about, and in 1974, Robert stopped King Crimson again, you know, for forever, as it were. This does several times. And then there was a lull, and like most performing musicians, you know, I'm terrified that I'll never play the drums again ever for anybody, you know. So you jump at the first person that moves who asks you to play, as it were. And somehow Roy was one of those people. I don't know quite why. It started as a session at Abbey Road, the famous Abbey Road studios. Chris Spedding on guitar, and an American bass player called Dave Cochran. And I forgot what the question was.
How you got connected with them.
Oh, well, yeah. And Roy was very well known in the UK. He's a real unsung treasure. He came up with, members of the Floyd. He was managed by the Floyd's manager. And also guys in Zeppelin knew him pretty well. What was Zeppelin's guitarist's name? Jimmy Page. Jimmy and he knew each other very well. And they'd been on each other's records and stuff. So Roy's been very well known, and I just joined him for an album and a tour.
I think too, maybe there's one of the archival pieces while we're kind of talking about some of this. Bill, you've got a great memory of working with people. You had some great gig notebooks that you kept over the years too, right? Of kind of keeping track of some of these sessions or gigs or different things that you did.
Yeah, I do. I did just, I don't know why. You start doing this stuff and then somehow you realize a couple of years gone past, you better keep going. So people tend to think I know everything that everywhere I've been. And
Well,
wow, look at that.
This goes back very far.
Well, it does.
I have an example from 1970, but yeah, you were really, again, I'll use the word meticulous about just tracking all the gigs you played, all the bands you played with, all the engagements, and then, really how much money you made, and statistics at the end of the year about, about everything.
About how much money we lost.
I love the average number of gigs a week too, and then compared to how much you were making on each bill. That's an important number for a musician to be aware of, right?
Absolutely. And partly what got me started in all this, Andy, was that when we went round the archives, you showed me, I think it was you, showed me Hal Blaine's gig book.
That's right.
The wonderful Hal Blaine, and there it was, and it said, drum porterage. And for people who don't know, that means the money you pay the guy to carry your drums to the studio. $28 kind of thing for some Beach Boys gig or something like that in the studio. And I felt really very akin to Hal, because I'd obviously done something similar where you're looking at it on screen. And I thought, maybe the Hall of Fame and your archives would be interested in a more complete version of all that and more. So that's partly what gave me the idea and brings us to where we are today. Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, your gig books look like art, though, and and Hal's are great too. But your handwriting and your organization is admirable.
Well, and the amazing thing about having that in the archive here at the Rock Hall is that, some of that stuff, Bill, like, you've lived it. For many people are thinking about what was your career like? What were these moments? Unless someone like yourself has a record of it, it's kind of gone. I mean, a lot of that stuff disappears.
It does indeed. And never trust a musician in interview because...
Right.
Like this one, because memories change and fade. And you think, did I really say that or play that? And unless you've got some evidence which says, in this year, I made zero money, and in this year, I turned into a wealthy man, then nobody believes this. There's no reason for anybody to believe you, which is why academic research is so important, because we need someone to say, well, what's the truth here?
Yeah. Well, and then further along, another decade later, we have some tour itineraries. I mean, you were really great about keeping those and saving them and preserving them. So we have here about 4 King Crimson tour itineraries from the early 80s. And as you go through them, you can kind of see, where all these engagements happened, where you stayed, what time sound check was, who the promoters were. And here we even see Jules Belkin, who we know here in town. This is a show in Akron back in '82. So, do you remember? I mean, could you maybe even any memories of this tour in particular?
No, I don't think so. Okay. It's just that you'd sort of be given one of these books on the first day of the tour, and I'd greet it with mixed blessing. And I'd kind of go, well, how long is this going on for? I've got a young family and stuff. Yeah. And once I was given one, I mean, my American colleagues will laugh at me, but once I was given one that lasted 9 weeks. Now, I'm telling you, to me, that's an awful long time to be on the road. But I know, Americans work much harder at music than Brits do. And would gladly, there's guys I know who've been out on the road in vans for months and months on end.
Yeah.
But in King Crimson, I promise you, you don't want to be there for more than 9 weeks.
And that is a weird experience to say, like, here's the book of the next 9 weeks of your life, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting moment to have that handed to you.
It is. And of course, you're grateful for it and you're thrilled to be doing it, of course. Yeah. And if you can just stop looking at the end and thinking,
right.
Will I ever get there?
Right. Well, Bill, we had one other category to talk about from the box set. This is the idea of the improviser. And I think for this, it cuts across sort of all the different groups you've played in. And you mentioned right at the top end when we were talking about it, this idea that whatever it is, whether it's with one person or a group, but the moment that you go in and say, okay, there's nothing necessarily predetermined, we're going to improvise on maybe an idea or a topic or a musical theme or something. To get you to talk a little bit about that, let's bring in here a tune. You did a number of records with Patrick Moraes, who also played in Yes for a while. And I think played organ and keyboards on Silently Falling with you on the Chris Squire record.
He actually did. That's right.
Right? Yeah, great organ solo, I think.
He was there. That's right.
Yeah. A favorite of mine is the 1985 album Flags that you guys did. Talk about that tune, or maybe even that relationship with Patrick, of this idea of drums and keyboard and improvising.
Yes. Well, I can't, Flags, the song Flags itself is not entirely improvised, but Symmetry is entirely improvised, for example. And again, along with a later colleague, Michael Borschlap, a Dutch pianist of great virtuosity, with piano and drums, they're just mutually wonderful instruments to play together, because basically I'm not going to contradict his harmony. I don't have harmony.
Right.
And, rhythm can be very flexible. The drum kit itself is a powerful beast, however. So I have the ability to raise and up the ante in terms of dynamics at any time I want, and remove them at any time I want. And you'll tend to find that the pianist will respond to that very easily. A lot of it is about sound and placement of sound. It's not always a pretty melody that you're looking for, although a pretty melody may be embedded in this improvisation. Not always. There's another improvisation in there called No Warning from King Crimson, which is entirely improvised, but is a nasty bit of post-industrial mayhem, which sounds a bit like a power station exploding. So that's a different way of a different contour, different quiet level of sound and weight of material. And pianists are very used to sitting at an instrument, playing on their own, and being able to start something and finish it with good form, good shape. And the drummer helps on that form and shape. And it's a wonderful way to play. But I assure you, if you're going out on stage to play for an hour and 20 in a concert hall in London, without a single prepared piece of music, and as you approach the drum stool, that can be scary, thinking, I don't know, what are we going to play? We'll find something. But it's a bit like a conversation, a bit like this. You start, I say something. We didn't know we were going to be here now in this conversation. We didn't plan it. We're kind of improvising verbally right now, and I'm making this up as I go along. And it's a wonderful way to play. So some of my favorite moments on the album, in fact, the last two tracks on the album are two of my favorites, I think. One's called Kinship with Michael Borschlap, and another is called Low Tide at Camber Sands.
When you do that sort of improvisation, do you enjoy that moment of building a framework around it before you go out there, or that other experience you sort of just mentioned of we're just going to go out there and see what happens? Do you prefer one or the other at all?
It's almost always the latter.
Yeah.
It's King Crimson used to have bolt on an improvisation at the front of the first composition it was going to do. And each musician would walk on stage, random musicians at night, every night, different every night, and play something. And then be joined by a second guy who would obviously try to take that somewhere else, and the third, and then the fourth. That order of musicians would change on a nightly basis. But apart from that, that's a contrivance, which is obviously going to affect your improvisation.
Right.
But I can do any number of little contrivances like that. People might say, let's go from very loud to very quiet.
Right.
That's the end of the instructions right there. Or let's go from very fast to very slow. End of instructions. So you can take it from very minimal information like that, or a whole ton of information. Doesn't bother me either way.
One of the other pieces on that disc that I thought was great is the piece Previous Man with David Torn, another great guitar player who uses a lot of electronics and looping and different things. Talk about working with David a little bit.
He did. David's a wonderful guy. He was up in Woodstock, New York. We had him also in a group called Bruford 11 Upper Extremities with David. David joined that band too. Chris Botti, very famous trumpet player now. So I've known David for much of the late, 20 years, I suppose, from the 90s through to the noughties. And he's an excellent guitar player, very interesting man. And that particular track was to do with early electronic drums being able to play a tune. And part of, I think I probably mentioned it in the liner notes here, but there's a little bit of drum stuff goes on in the tune, kind of drum solo, if you like, where all my drums are attached to pitches. So I have four notes at I've only got 4 drums, and I've got 4 notes attached, a note attached to each of the 4 drums. And I'm able to play with that little configuration and make up little tunes as a guide to a solo. So that's a nice way of working too. We're always looking for different ways to work, different ways to make the drums sing, make them dance, making a song and dance. And Previous Man suited that really well. Etc.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll stop singing now.
No,
no, thank you. It's great.
Just thinking about all the collaborators we've just mentioned, and I think you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but in your memoir, you mentioned you talk a little bit about the difference between Brits and Americans, and I think in terms of the work ethic. Could you speak to that at all in terms of just in the context of different bands or artists you've worked with?
That's a big topic.
Okay.
Broadly, my American colleagues were always perfectly happy to work extremely hard on an instrument and get extremely good at it. On the whole, that's viewed with some suspicion in England, who value the cult of the amateur.
Yeah.
So Winston Churchill, the great wartime leader, we would have thought of as an amateur. Wasn't a professional politician at all. We like amateurs who somehow have a stroke of genius. The trouble is, when it gets too amateurish, like the Sex Pistols, it's not going to be any good at all. But we kind of the American work ethic is a wonderful thing. So there has been a lot of great music played in the UK by people. The Beatles were amateurs too, by people who didn't really know what they were doing and probably couldn't do anything else outside of what they did. Whereas in the States, a lot of great music a lot of not so great music is played brilliantly well. So our stuff was quite good, played not very well, and often in the States it's played very well, but it's not such a good idea. So there was that kind of thing going on. You see what I mean? What are we executing here, and what do we care? What do we care about this? Do we care that it's perfectly in time and perfectly in tune and all the rest of it? Whereas I don't mind mistakes at all. I mean, mistakes are riddled throughout this box. Probably I could point out mistakes to you. But an American, on the whole, wouldn't appreciate a mistake of any nature. So it's a slight difference. It's a subtle one, but I think it's a fair one.
Yeah. Yeah, some of that idea too might play into why I think some of the progressive rock stuff you've done has been so popular in the United States. I think fans really appreciate that sort of level of musicianship that they see in bands like Yes or Crimson or something like that.
Yeah, possibly so. And also the outlandish ideas, that on the whole seem to be, the cult in the United States seem to be more, it should be like something we've already heard before.
Right.
Whereas in my general first 20 years I was around, it felt a bit like that. Whereas in the UK, it should be something that we've never heard before. Yeah. And that seemed to be praised more.
Yeah, and you took that throughout your career, I think. I mean, in terms of, especially in terms of kind of the drum kit and changing it, preparing it in different ways, and of course the electronic stuff too, right?
That's what I thought you were paying me to do.
Right.
I didn't realize not everybody was the same. I thought everybody wanted to imagine what it might be like tomorrow. And not everybody does, and I understand that totally.
Sure. Well, Andy, we should say as we kind of wrap up here, the collection we've been talking about today is available now at the Library and Archive, right?
It is. It's been processed. It's fully available. both physically, and then a good portion of it we've digitized. Bill's gig books and scrapbooks are already digitized, so all of that is available at our library and archives a couple miles here from our museum here in Cleveland. And again, it includes everything we've kind of been looking at: tour itineraries, financial statements, royalties information, contracts, a lot of the business side of things. But then, like I said, Bill's scrapbooks and gig books kind of tell you the story from his perspective, kind of going through it all. And it's a real treasure trove of information, and it's all here for not just for scholars and teachers and students, but for us to use, for educators,
and for the Rockwell, right,
and for curators.
That's
so
great.
we very much appreciate your generous donation.
Pleasure, guys. Well, I'm thrilled. It's going to be of some use, I think.
Absolutely, no doubt.
To have a detail. I mean, this is the academic, the musicologist part of me, right? Is saying that 50 years time, 100 years time, when they want to know what it was like, for a guy in the last 3 decades of the 20th century, starting as a musician, what would that look like? And there are some detail and facts which will be in your archives, which I think is great for anybody who wants to know what that was like in 100 years time. Might not be tomorrow, but in 100 years,
right.
You might be interested. We hope.
Mm-hmm. And you serve as a great example for other musicians who should also be thinking about preserving their own legacies.
Yeah, I think something in that.
And we, of course, should mention again, too, Bill Bruford, Making a Song and Dance, a complete career collection. Really a lot of fun, Bill. I mentioned this to you before we even came on live here. It was just so fun listening through even the various shifts from one track to the other, sometimes from the different work you've done.
Yeah.
And a great book with some photos and really beautifully put together as well. So everyone can check that out. Bill Bruford, a complete career collection. And of course, so much other great music Bill has participated in over the year. We didn't even talk about UK or your time with Genesis. So much work you've done, Bill.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again so much for joining us. It's been a really great pleasure to talk to you today.
Pleasure for me too. Good to see you guys.
You too. Thanks so much, Bill.